Okay, Professor Kearney, I have a couple of things struck me during the talk today. One of them was the idea of the Romulus and Remus myth, and kind of how that is different from the propaganda that demonstrates a difference between us and them, where the Romulus and Remus myth kind of shows how that problem is actually inherent within us. It's inherent within that construct. There's something there to be examined. And then the other thing was toward the end when you were talking about the Greek poet Orpheus and how he says, or is suggesting, that we've got to get back to our instinct of love and our instinct of death in order to resolve this issue. And out of the suggestions, that was the one that I related most with, I think. So I'm kind of curious then, if I'm looking at those two things rightly, if you think it would be possible to create a myth that examines the truth as opposed to being just another piece of propaganda of us versus them, that would help bring us to a better understanding of the instinct of love and the instinct of death, kind of awakening us to some kind of truth or realization in ourselves about that to help dissolve the problem at its foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very good question, and it's true that in the presentation today I was concentrating on the more propagandistic and ideological and falsificatory uses of myth. But as you point out, it's also possible to have myths that don't just deal with death and violence and sacrifice, but also with love and also with truth. The fact is that in the Romulus and Remus myth, the city is founded upon the killing of one brother by another. So that in one sense is internal. There's an ambiguity there at least. It's one brother that kills another brother. Just as in the Greek version you have, or equivalent, you have Prometheus and Epimetheus, or in the Bible you have Cain and Abel. And that's a recognition that the quarrel is an intra-familial one. But the brother who's killed, be it Cain, who is ostracized and extradited, east of Eden, or Prometheus, who is chained to his rock, or Remus, who is consigned to the earth, and in a way back to his vulpine origins, the wolf that harbored him and nourished him. What you get is a truth and a lie. The truth is that it was two brothers from the same family. The lie is that the brothers were des frères ennemis, fraternal adversaries, who then split off, one into purity and the other into impurity. Abel becomes the founder of the Abrahamic, Mosaic, Jewish chosen race. Cain becomes the outsider, the Caliban, the demon, the monster. So the myth tells you both a truth and also a lie, or at least, if you want to be more generous about it, it tells us the truth of how the lie was created, how one brother was set off against another and demonized into the ultimate enemy and threat. In terms of myths that tell a story of love in addition to a story of death and violence, I think all the great myths do that. I didn't concentrate on them this evening because we were talking more about monsters. But I think if it's the Oedipus myth, the Iphigenia myth, the Cuchulainn myth, the Arthurian myths, you find again and again an affirmation of Orphic eros as much as Orphic thanatos. And it's not a question of myths being good or bad. It's a question of myths being neither good nor bad, but thinking makes them so. It's the uses to which we put them. It's the interpretations which we give them. It's the way we enact them politically and socially that gives them a malignant or a benign potency.
Professor Kearney, in your discussion with your colleagues for a solution between the division of us and them, have you considered the Canadian, or what I like to call the Canadian situation, where I'm a Canadian, have no clear identity of who we are. Therefore, there is no clear us and them. Canada, more specifically, the city of Toronto, is comprised largely of immigrants, people, what Jürgen Habermas would refer to as displaced people. We don't have that clear division. in Toronto, with its influx of immigrant, 250,000 per year, 25% of the population of Toronto have been in Canada for 5 years or less. There is no dichotomy of us and them. I suggest that that would be a solution to this us and them division. What do you...
I think that's a very interesting proposal, and I think it goes very much in the sense of, say, what Kant and Habermas and a lot of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment philosophers would argue is a solution, sort of a single government made up of a multiplicity of different races based on the fact that we are all equal as individuals and as groups. In the Canadian case, what you have already is sort of an open door towards that, in that there is already recognition of two nationalities, the Francophone and the Anglophone, within the Canadian Constitution. And now more recently, more than two. You could therefore argue multiple ethnic identities, in that the Inuit Indians and other Native American tribes are being recognized as having certain sovereignty claims. So add to that this new wave, or these multiple waves of immigration from abroad, and what you've got is a mixing and a hybridization of the ethnic population, which is, in a sense, perhaps even appeasing the traditional conflict between the British and the French, particularly around the question of Quebec, and making all citizens of Canada realize that they are now part of a more cosmopolitan nation-state federation that is open to multiple kinds of identity. And certainly in that instance, it's very hard to scapegoat a particular community or a particular group or a particular race as monstrous or as alien.
How do you see these themes of demonization and deification evolving to include the growing presence of technology or the virtual in the cultural unconscious? If you look at some of even the first video games like Doom or Quake, they are basically recreations of some of the previous forms, like going and killing Nazis in a dungeon, or searching through a labyrinth to seek and destroy the Minotaur. And even if you look in popular films like Terminator, technology has taken the form of the evil other who's out to destroy humanity and against whom we must protect ourselves, or against the Matrix, and we are basked in a world of technology, and we must find our way out to even the safe home in the film is called Zion, even. So how do you see our popular culture taking on this form of the cybernetic, of the virtual, which is even more abstract than extraterrestrial, and even more unknown and undetermined? Quite literally, in culture, we don't know what we're going to be able to do with it. So how do you see these forms and these themes taking place in new forms?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think what's curious about the technological revolution and the emergence of virtual and digital and cybernetic beings is that they are usually half human and half non-human. Now, traditionally, monsters were half human and half animal, but in the modern alien movies, as for example in Men in Black, when they open up the little old man, the agent, they discover, this little alien inside him, and it's a little mechanical process that's at work, a cybernetic, robotic, mechanical process. So what you've got here, I think, is interesting. And it can either turn towards deification or demonism. It's the recognition that within the human order, there are dimensions that are beyond the human, that are inhuman or non-human. And that can be represented by the robotic or by the supernatural. It can go in the direction of the god, or it can go in the direction of the monster. But in both cases, there is a recognition that there is a limit to what human intelligence, human sensibility, and even human imagination can do. That's something we can fear, or it's something we can revere. But I think the films you mentioned and the phenomenon you mentioned, it comes out in the Alien series, in Predator, and many other examples, Men in Black being a case in point. The alien can be malign or benign. There are malign and benign aliens who are quasi-human, quasi-robotic in Men in Black, and one finds that in a series of other movies as well. The alien doesn't always have to be demonized, although that's the basic story I was telling this evening. The alien can also be apotheosized and deified and revered and idealized, and one even finds certain cult religions that believe that aliens are divine. The Raelians, for example, believe that the aliens are the true face of God. The alien is the true face of God. David Koresh and his community in Waco, Texas, believed that the New Jerusalem was an alien spacecraft, and so on and so forth. There are many New World and New Age religions out there that believe that the Messiah is an alien. So what I'm saying is that in this borderland of not knowing and of undecidability, of human and inhuman, or human and half-human, there's an open door to both paranoia and psychosis and hysteria of the enemy without, which feeds the scapegoating and the demonizing tendency that we identified thus far. But there is also an openness to the possibility of a benign otherness and transcendence and alterity that may well bring our salvation. Thank you.
In the South African truth and reconciliation situation, first of all, how does a victim demand justice from a perpetrator if the perpetrator is no longer viewed as the other? And secondly, how does the victim tell his or her own story, right, about the malign other and avoid demonizing and a continuation of the demonization of the other?
It's a very interesting question, a very topical one, and a very practical one, both in Africa today and also in places like Northern Ireland and indeed the Balkans, where communities have to exchange stories in this way. I think, to take your latter point first, it's very important when the victim tells his or her story that the victimizer listens to the story insofar as possible, imaginatively, as if he or she were the victim. In other words, what's very difficult for a victimizer is to get out of his own skin and see himself not as a self, but as another. It was to switch sides like that. And it's important for the victim to hear the story of the victimizer so as to understand how the victimizer became caught in a host of lies or a host of ideologies or a host of prejudices, which then the victim will try through words to undo, to negotiate, to respond to in words. Now you might say, but this is just a replay of what went on in the street or on in the battlefield. But the very fact that you move from action to words, you engage in what Freud would call the talking cure, is that words and images, by exchanging stories and memories, enable us or invite us to a certain kind of vicarious experience where we're not locked into ourselves in the same way and can somehow, through words and images, in a way that we could maybe not do physically with our own bodies, change sides and imagine what it is like to be the other. As Lear had to realize, King Lear in Shakespeare's play, through his imagination, what it feels like to feel what wretches feel. He'd never felt before. But through the exchange of stories, the hope is, and one cannot be naive about this, there are some people who don't want to hear your story and don't want to tell their story, but if both groups are prepared to listen and to tell, then the chances are that there may be a greater convergence of horizons, and that the victimizer may, through this process, seek pardon for what he has done, and that the victim may be able to give a certain conditional or unconditional pardon in that context. Nobody can deny the difficulty involved, but I don't know of a better way of trying to de-demonize people that have been demonized, particularly, of course, the victim. It's, in some respects, more of a duty for the victimizer, the colonizer, the tyrant, to listen to the story of the victim than vice versa. But in any dialogue, it is good to hear both sides so that, as I say, some kind of reconciliation can be brought about, which does not mean an acceptance of what the victimizer has done. You know, oh, it was fine to torture, oh, it was fine to, you know, behead my family or whatever. What it means is that instead of allowing these things to be forgotten, amnesia, you bring it back to remembrance, and on the basis of remembrance, there may be a certain limited form of amnesty. But you can't have amnesty based on amnesia, and you can't have amnesia based on stories. So storytelling, exchange of memories is the first, and testimonies is the first step beyond forgetfulness, beyond amnesia, so that then maybe some kind of amnesty can be worked towards or gestured towards. But it's an extremely painful and difficult task of mourning, of therapy, and of truth-telling.
Is it even possible for cultures at large to transcend these myths of purity and superiority in constant struggle with some type of alien or other? Or these mythological forms that satisfy, that are needed in order to satisfy some deep and intrinsic psychological need that individuals have in order to understand themselves, their origins, and their present situation?
There may well be in every human being and every human psyche a need to make separations, distinctions, dichotomies. You know, as Levi-Strauss says, all civilizations begin with the demarcation of culture from nature, good from bad, pure from impure, those you can marry, those you can't marry. That's the incest taboo. What is edible, what is not edible, what is better eaten cooked, what is better eaten raw, and so on and so forth. So I think it is a fundamental need of the human psyche to make those kinds of distinctions. And brought to an extreme, that's the distinction between the saint and the stranger, between us and them, between the divine and the demonic. I don't think that one should deny that or should even try to eradicate that. I think the important point, however, is to try and live that in a way that does not lead to the sacrificial bloodletting of innocent outsiders. And one of the best ways to prevent that from happening is, I think, to live out this need for sacrificial myths and divisions and purgations at the level of fantasy and image and word, that is to say at the level of culture, rather than at the literal level of war. So the more work we do in ourselves in terms of acknowledging our inner violence, our inner melancholy, our inner angers and fantasies of others as good and bad, the more likely we are to express that through talk and through narrative and through imagination, and the less likely we are to act it out on the streets in terms of violence. In other words, to have it acted out for us and through us by some kind of unconscious, which in many instances we do not appear to be fully in control of. Now, when I say that, I would just add a qualification. Sometimes in the media portrayals, which are through narratives and stories and images, these things are acted out for us. And that may be purgative in certain instances. In other instances, if it is kept from us and serves rather as a kind of manipulation, a kind of bread and circuses, a sort of, how shall I put it, vicarious mode of manipulation and propaganda, in those instances, we are not doing the work that we need to displace the aggressive energies of thanatos and death and violence from the depths of the unconscious into some kind of narrative story that can act, as Aristotle says, as a form of purgation by pity and fear, but a purgation that does not mean an altar, a sacrificial implement, and a human being whose blood needs to be let in order for the community to be reconciled with itself.